Nestled in the valley where the mountains met the sky, the village of Valsar was a place where tradition and nature intertwined. The air was thick with the earthy scent of freshly tilled soil, and the sound of daily life hummed gently in the background. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the laughter of children playing by the well, and the soft murmur of gossip shared between elders on the front porches of their adobe homes. It was a place where time seemed to slow, where life moved in a circle, planting of seeds, the harvest, the seasons repeating in harmonious rhythm. In Valsar, people respected the land, their families, and the unspoken customs passed down from generation to generation. At the heart of this village lived a man named Jamil. He was the son of the village's late blacksmith and, by all accounts, a good and hard-working man. His calloused hands spoke of years spent shaping iron, but it was his gentle spirit that set him apart. Jamil's heart was as strong as the metal he forged, but it was his compassion that marked him as a pillar in his community. Even when times were tough, when the seasons didn't yield as much, or when illness swept through the village, Jamil remained a steady force, offering help where it was needed without hesitation. Jamil was a man of quiet strength, the kind of man who would wake before dawn to tend to the fields and would stay up late to repair broken tools for his neighbours. His kindness was woven into the very fabric of his being, and he had no greater love than for his daughter, Lena. She was the light of his life, a small, sprightly girl with a bright smile that could warm even the coldest of hearts. Lena's mother had passed when she was just a baby, and since then, Jamil had raised her on his own. His devotion to her knew no bounds. In a village where family was everything, Jamil and Lena had created their own unbreakable bond, a bond that had been their source of strength for years. But beneath the peaceful surface of their life, tensions simmered. Jamil's brother, Yusuf, who had once been a carefree man, had changed over the years. Where once there had been warmth, there was now only distance. Yusuf's bitterness had grown in direct proportion to his failure to establish his own family. His resentment towards Jamil, whom he blamed for his own misfortunes, was a constant undercurrent in their interactions. While Jamil and Lena shared a deep love and understanding, Yusuf's jealousy festered in silence, poisoning their family dynamic. The village had often whispered about the growing strain between the brothers, and as the years passed, the silence between them became louder. But none could have foreseen how far that silence would go, nor how it would shatter the peaceful life that Jamil and Lena had fought so hard to build. It was the arrival of the harvest season that set the events into motion. When the sun was high and the village was alive with the bustle of gathering and celebrating the fruits of the earth. For Jamil and Lena, it should have been a time of joy, of working side by side, collecting the crops they'd laboured over for months. But as the fields ripened, so did the seeds of a far darker harvest. It began with an unexpected visit from Yusuf, who arrived one early morning, his face drawn and dark. He was usually a quiet man, keeping to himself. But today there was an edge to his voice, an anger that crackled beneath every word he spoke. He demanded that Jamil give him a portion of the harvest, not out of need, but out of a deep resentment. He claimed that Jamil had always taken what was rightfully his, their father's inheritance, the land, the respect of the villagers. In his eyes, Jamil had somehow wronged him by being the one to carry on the family's name, by being the successful one. Jamil, taken aback, tried to reason with his brother, offering him what little extra there was in the granary, hoping to keep the peace. But Yusuf's demands escalated, quickly turning from practical requests into accusations, each more unfounded than the last. Jamil, ever the peacemaker, stood his ground, unwilling to allow his brother's bitterness to take root in his daughter's life. But the real blow came later, when Yusuf's jealousy took a darker turn. With a cruel, twisted smile, he insinuated that Lena was the true source of his anger, that it was her presence, her very existence, that had made Jamil weak, distracted, and blinded to his responsibilities. The words stung. Jamil's heart, already burdened by years of unspoken tension, broke under the weight of his brother's venom. Lena, standing in the doorway, heard the entire exchange, and in that moment, the trust and innocence she had in her family began to fracture. Yusuf's spiteful nature was now laid bare. It was no longer just a matter of a man and his land. It was a war that had long been brewing beneath the surface, and now Jamil found himself at the heart of a battle he never asked for, fighting not just for his own survival, but for his daughter's future. The days that followed Yusuf's visit were marked by a palpable tension, like a storm hanging on the horizon, waiting for the right moment to unleash its fury. Jamil and Lena tried their best to return to their routine, but the weight of Yusuf's bitterness clouded their once peaceful lives. Every morning, as Jamil worked the fields, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was always just out of reach. The sun felt harsher, the labour more burdensome, and even the steady rhythm of the forge seemed to falter beneath his hands. But it was not the physical exhaustion that drained him. It was the growing sense of betrayal, the gnawing realization that someone he had once trusted had turned against him. Yusuf's behaviour began to grow more erratic. He would arrive at Jamil's house unannounced, lingering outside for hours with a threatening silence, watching as Lena and Jamil worked in the garden. At first, Jamil thought little of it, attributing it to his brother's ever-growing jealousy. But when Yusuf's presence began to feel like an encroaching shadow, something darker and more deliberate, Jamil knew it had escalated. The first real attack came one evening when Jamil returned from the fields to find a crowd gathered in front of his home. At first, he thought it was just another of the village's impromptu social gatherings, but as he drew closer, the voices grew more insistent, more accusing. A local merchant, an older man named Karim, stepped forward. "Jamil, is it true? Are you the one causing this unrest? Your brother says you've taken too much from the land that rightfully belongs to him." Jamil's heart sank. Karim had always been a fair man, and the accusations stunned him. He looked to the crowd for understanding, but the faces before him were cold. His brother had already poisoned the well of trust, planting seeds of doubt that were now bearing fruit. "Karim, this is madness!" Jamil pleaded, his voice rising in desperation. "You know me. You know I have worked this land my whole life. Why would I take from Yusuf?" But Yusuf was not there. His absence only deepened the suspicion, making Jamil look guilty in the eyes of those who had never questioned his integrity before. Word had already spread, and the seeds of mistrust had taken root among the villagers. Those who once greeted Jamil with smiles now greeted him with furtive glances. The weight of his brother's words followed him like a chain. Lena, ever perceptive, sensed the shift in the air. One evening, after the incident, she found Jamil sitting by the hearth, his face buried in his hands, the flickering light casting deep shadows over his weary expression. She sat beside him, her small hand resting gently on his. "Papa, what's happening to us?" Jamil's heart tightened. How could he explain the depths of betrayal to his young daughter, the very girl he swore to protect from the harshness of the world? "It's not your fault, Lena. It's just, your uncle is angry, and sometimes people forget who you really are." "But why?" she asked, the confusion in her eyes so clear it broke his heart. He couldn't answer her, not fully. All he could offer was a weary smile, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "I don't know, my dear, but we'll get through this, together." Despite his best efforts, the strain of the situation weighed heavily on Jamil. He began to question every decision he made, wondering if perhaps he had been too kind, too lenient, too trusting. As the days turned into weeks, Yusuf's attacks grew more personal and more insidious. One evening, as Jamil returned from the village square, he saw Yusuf standing at the edge of his property, his back to the house, facing the distant horizon. The posture itself was a threat. Jamil's stomach churned with anticipation. "Yusuf!" Jamil called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "What is it now?" Yusuf turned slowly, a dark glint in his eyes. "I see you've been speaking to the villagers. Don't think for a moment that I'm going to let this go. You've been stealing from me, and I'll have what's mine, one way or another." Jamil clenched his fists, his patience wearing thin. "You've got nothing, Yusuf. Everything I have, everything we have, is earned by my hands. I've never taken from you. Is that so?" Yusuf's voice dropped to a near whisper, full of venom. "Then explain to me why you've been hiding your little daughter from me. Is she in on this too? Is she helping you take what's mine?" Jamil's heart froze. His brother's words were cruel, a knife in the gut. But the accusation about Lena, about his innocent girl, was the breaking point. He stepped forward, his voice low and unwavering. "You will not speak of my daughter like that. Never again." For a moment, neither man spoke. The wind rustled through the trees, the only sound in the charged silence. Then Yusuf, with a mock bow, turned and walked away, leaving Jamil standing in the fading light, his hands trembling with the weight of the confrontation. As the days passed, Yusuf's tactics grew more aggressive. He began spreading false rumours, claiming that Jamil was hoarding supplies, taking more than his fair share of the harvest. Some of the villagers began to shun Jamil, no longer offering their help or support when his back was bent with work. Others, like the old widow Aisha, quietly expressed their sympathy, slipping small tokens of food or grain into his hands when no one was watching. "Stay strong, Jamil. The truth always comes to light," she whispered one afternoon as she passed by, offering him a loaf of bread. But these small acts of kindness, while appreciated, were not enough to quell the rising tide of suspicion. Jamil could feel the walls closing in. He could feel Lena pulling away from him, asking fewer questions but carrying a weight in her eyes that he could no longer ignore. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a group of men arrived at Jamil's doorstep. It was clear they weren't here to offer assistance. "Jamil," the village elder, Salim, said with a grim expression, "Yusuf has made his case to the council. He's accusing you of theft, and it's not just about the harvest anymore. He's saying that you've been manipulating the village's affairs for your own gain." Jamil stood silent, disbelief and anger flashing through him. "This is a lie. You know me. You know I've done nothing wrong." The elder's face softened, but there was no denying the pressure the council was under. "I'm afraid there's not much we can do. The accusations have spread too far. It's not just about land or harvest anymore. Your brother's claims have poisoned the air, Jamil." The weight of those words crushed him, and as the men left, he knew the stakes had changed. It was no longer just about him and his brother. It was about his daughter's future, their very place in the village, and he was losing everything. As Jamil stood alone, the darkness of the night seemed to close in on him. His heart ached for Lena. His mind raced, searching for a way to clear his name, to stop the lies from taking root. But deep down, he knew that something far more profound was happening. His family, his home, everything he had fought for was slowly slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The turning point came on a bleak morning when the weather mirrored the heaviness in Jamil's heart. The village had gathered once more, this time at the communal square, where the council had called for an official hearing to resolve the ongoing accusations. Jamil stood there in silence, his hands clenched at his sides. The familiar faces of his neighbours now distant, as though they looked through him instead of at him. Even the sun, usually so warm and steady, seemed to burn too brightly today, its harsh rays cutting through the heavy air, making everything feel unbearably oppressive. Yusuf had arrived early, his presence a dark shadow that spread over the square. The rumours he had spun over the past weeks had worked their poison, turning friend against friend, and no one, it seemed, was willing to stand by Jamil. Even those who had once trusted him now looked upon him with doubt, unsure of where the truth lay. It wasn't just the harvest that had been stolen in their eyes. It was the very foundation of his life, his character, that had been called into question. When the council called the meeting to order, it felt less like a chance for justice and more like a public execution. Yusuf stood tall, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as he spun his version of the truth. He accused Jamil of hoarding supplies, of betraying the trust of the villagers, and of dishonouring their father's memory. His voice rang out with conviction, the weight of his words heavy in the tense air, and with each word, Jamil felt the walls of his world crumble. He tried to speak up, to defend himself, but the words stuck in his throat. His voice, once steady and sure, trembled under the pressure. No one believed him anymore. Not even the village elder, Salim, who had once been his friend, gave him the benefit of doubt. "The evidence is clear, Jamil," Salim said quietly, avoiding his gaze. "There's little left to say." The verdict was swift. Jamil was to be removed from his position in the village council, and a portion of his land was to be divided between Yusuf and the others who had supported his claims. It was the death sentence of a life he had built with his own hands. The betrayal hit harder than anything he had ever experienced. His own flesh and blood had not only torn apart his reputation, but had fractured the very soul of his existence. That night, after the council had dispersed, Jamil returned to his home in a daze. His thoughts were muddled, his steps slow, as though the weight of the world had settled squarely on his shoulders. He walked through the front door to find Lena sitting in the dim light of the kitchen, her face drawn and tired. She'd been quiet all evening, and the look in her eyes, a mix of confusion and sadness, spoke volumes. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Are we leaving? Are they really taking our land?" The question cut deeper than any accusation. The pain in her voice, the fear in her eyes, made Jamil feel like he was drowning. He had failed her. How could he explain this to her? How could he protect her from the ugliness of the world when he couldn't even protect their home? He sank to his knees before her, his face a mask of helplessness. "I'm sorry, Lena," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know what to do anymore." Lena's small hand reached out and touched his cheek, her touch warm and tender. "It's okay, Papa. We'll be okay. I know we will." Her simple words, full of childlike faith, struck him to the core. In that moment, despite the storm swirling around him, there was a flicker, a tiny, stubborn spark that refused to die. He had spent so many days focusing on what he was losing that he had forgotten what he still had: his daughter, his love for her, and the strength she unknowingly gave him. For the first time in weeks, Jamil stood up, wiped the tears from his eyes, and glanced out the window at the land that had been his father's, his grandfather's, and now his own. The situation was dire. The forces arrayed against him were immense, but one thing remained certain: he would not let this be the end. He had to fight, not just for himself, but for Lena, for the future they deserved, free from the chains of jealousy and lies. There was no clear path yet, but the smallest glimmer of hope had sparked within him. He didn't know how, but he would find a way to clear his name and protect the legacy he had built. With Lena's hand in his, he felt a renewed sense of determination. No matter what the world had thrown at him, he would not give up. Not now, not ever. The day of reckoning came with the arrival of a storm, the kind that seemed to sweep everything in its path, cleansing and destructive all at once. Jamil had spent the past few days in seclusion, planning his next move with a quiet desperation. The council's decision had been the final straw, and the weight of his failure had nearly crushed him. But the words Lena had spoken to him that night, the trust she still had in him, the belief that things would be okay, kept him going. It was time to confront the heart of the matter: Yusuf. Jamil knew that if he didn't act now, he would lose everything. His reputation, his home, his dignity, nothing would be left. But he also knew that if he let the lies continue, it would be a fate worse than death. He could not, would not, stand by as his brother destroyed their family. The confrontation took place at the village square, the very place where Jamil had been publicly humiliated. This time, he wasn't just standing there waiting for the verdict. He was prepared to take action. He'd spent the past few days gathering evidence from those few villagers who still believed in him, piecing together a story that could expose Yusuf's lies. As the crowd gathered, Jamil stepped into the centre, his eyes fixed on his brother, who was standing confidently at the edge of the assembly, eyes gleaming with the expectation of victory. "Yusuf!" Jamil called out, his voice clear and strong. "This ends today." The crowd fell silent, the tension thick. Yusuf's smirk faded. replaced by a look of confusion. "What are you talking about, Jamil?" Yusuf scoffed. "This is your last chance. Your lies have finally caught up with you." "No," Jamil said, stepping forward. "It's your lies that have caught up with you." With that, he presented the evidence. Testimonies from the villagers who had seen Yusuf take more than his fair share of the harvest, and proof that he had been secretly scheming to take control of their father's land, not just out of need, but out of pure greed. Jamil's voice rose with conviction as he laid bare Yusuf's deceit. The crowd murmured, some in disbelief, others in shock. Slowly, the weight of Jamil's words sank in. Yusuf, realizing the trap had been sprung, tried to retreat, but the villagers were already turning on him. His web of lies unraveled as quickly as it had been spun. In the end, Yusuf was forced to leave the village, his reputation tarnished beyond repair. The council reversed their decision, restoring Jamil's land and his place in the village. As Jamil stood there, watching his brother's departure, the storm that had raged within him began to settle. He had stood firm, and in doing so, he had restored his honor. With Lena by his side, Jamil felt a quiet peace settle over him. It had been a long, hard journey, but they had made it through together. And in that moment, as the first rays of the sun broke through the clouds, Jamil knew that his life was about to begin anew. In the months that followed, life in the village began to heal. Jamil's name was cleared, and his reputation slowly mended. Like a tree that had been bent by a storm but remained standing, the villagers who had once doubted him now returned with apologies, some offering small tokens of gratitude, others simply standing by him in quiet solidarity. The land he had worked for so many years was once again his, and with Lena at his side, Jamil was able to rebuild their lives. The bond between father and daughter grew even stronger as they worked together to restore the farm, their laughter echoing through the fields, a sound that had been absent for far too long. Jamil's heart swelled with pride as Lena began to take more interest in the land, learning the ways of the earth and the forge, determined to carry on their family's legacy. The future, once uncertain, now seemed full of promise. As for Yusuf, his schemes had backfired. The villagers, who had once followed him blindly, saw through his deception, and, in the end, he was forced to leave Valsar. He wandered from village to village, a man without a home or a place in the world, consumed by his bitterness and envy. The very thing he had sought to take from Jamil, respect, love, and honor, was forever lost to him. The lesson was clear. Greed and jealousy could never bring lasting happiness, while honesty, resilience, and love always found a way to persevere. Jamil's life had been a testament to the truth that good, in the end, triumphs over adversity. He had faced darkness and betrayal, but by standing firm, he had found not only justice, but peace. The strongest roots grow in the toughest soil, Jamil often told Lena, reminding her that no matter the storms, their family would always endure. Thank you for joining Jamil and Lena on their journey. Their story reminds us that even in the darkest of times, the strength of family, the power of resilience, and the light of truth can guide us through. We all face moments of challenge, betrayal, and uncertainty, but like Jamil, we have the ability to rise, stand firm, and rebuild our lives, one step at a time. Now, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever faced a time when standing up for what's right seemed impossible? How did you find the strength to overcome it? Share your thoughts or your own story in the comments below. Let's support each other in this journey of life. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And tell us where you're watching from. Let's keep this conversation going across the globe. Remember, no matter what you face today, you are not alone. Keep going, and good will always find its way.